We're going to start with class 14. This is part 2 of the life of Muhammad, but we're going to start a little differently as a result of a point I wanted to make before we get started. And it's something I say in that introductory script that I have composed for the class. And that is, there is no class of scholars. And what I have found over the years is some of the most creative and imaginative questions and answers come from people who are not students of religion, who are just ordinary Baha'is, if anybody who's a Baha'i can be said to be ordinary, but who think creatively and use the faith and the writings creatively. So last week, our dear friend, James Williams, who's a very creative mind, we always have wonderful discussions, asked about the cleaving of the moon, which is an Islamic myth, I guess is the best way to categorize it. And I wanted just to show you briefly how that question led me to find the answer by using the Baha'i lens. I did misspell Baha'i there, but I'll fix that later. So just very briefly, how does the Baha'i lens help us unveil the truth? And this is what this whole course is about, really. How using, as we've said many times, how looking at past history of the Abrahamic religions, we understand them even better than the original followers in some cases, and certainly better than contemporary followers in some cases. So you have the cleaving of the moon as a myth that Muhammad literally did this. And to show you how literally, this is a 16th century portrait of Muhammad pointing. Notice his face is covered because the image of Muhammad is not to be shown. And no images are to be shown in the mosque. And of course, we do the same thing with the Baha'i houses of worship, no images or icons of any sort. But you see this symbolism of this. The moon is split in two. Well, what does that mean? Well, here's a photograph NASA took from Apollo 10 in 1969, and you see there seems to be a split in the moon. And of course, the internet went nuts with some Muslims who take this literally, joyously observing that indeed Muhammad did it. So we use the Baha'i lens as ordinary Baha'is, not as scholars, and we go to an ordinary place, Wikipedia, which despite all the bad rap it gets is really not that bad. Because if nothing else, it gives you the sources, if you'll look at the footnotes, from which you can find better information if you don't like the information that's there. Plus, it's being daily updated as opposed to the old. I was talking to Lucia about our using the old Encyclopedia Britannica and the Compton's Encyclopedia prior to that, and how long it would take to look up a single fact. And now we have all this lovely information at our fingertips. And so we look up on Wikipedia, and it says the entire myth derives from but one passage in the Quran. And so we look up the Quran when we find that it says the splitting of the moon is a miracle in Muslim tradition attributed to the Islamic prophet Muhammad. It is derived from the Quran, Surah 54, 1, verses 1 through 2. So we open our Quran, which I presume you have. If you don't, there's plenty of them available online that are very good insofar as being easily looked up. Ocean, the Baha'i resource, has it. And here are the first two lines. The hour of judgment is nigh, and the moon is cleft asunder. But if they see a sign, capital S, they turn away and say, this is but a transient magic. They reject the warning and follow their own lust, but every matter has its appointed time. It goes on, but I'm going to stop there because obviously what this is talking about is the day of judgment, which we know as Baha'is is referring to the advent of the Bab. Unfortunately, as James observed last week, the moon, which represents the manifestation or his religion, you can look at it either way. The sun is God, the moon is the manifestation reflecting the light of God, or the manifestation is the sun and the moon is the religion reflecting the manifestation. which is the more likely of the two explanations. And so the religion is, as we're going to see in our study, from the death of Muhammad, from its inception, basically, it is split in two, never to be conjoined again. Now, this doesn't mean that everything that happens afterward is an aberration, but it means that the religion is bereft of the possibilities it would have had the covenant of Muhammad not been breached, something we'll discuss in great detail. It means when the time comes for the Muslims to recognize the advent of the Qaim or the Mahdi, both of those terms we'll discuss, but in other words, the return of the 12th Imam, it'll be split, and they won't understand the sign, and they'll be judged accordingly. You notice the term warner down here in verse 5. Muhammad calls himself a warner, among his most important attributes. He's come to warn them. Warn them of what? Of the day of judgment. So what was done with this verse? This is a quote from Bahai about the same verse. And he's talking about the examples of the literalism that leads astray the followers of various religions. For example, the Muslims say that Muhammad cleft the moon and that it fell on the mountain of Mecca. They think that the moon is a small body which Muhammad divided into two parts and threw one part on this mountain and the other part on another mountain. Such stories are pure fanaticism. And fanaticism is a good word to use, not just literalism, but fanaticism. I will discuss that later if you want. Also, the traditions which are the clergy quote and the incidents which they find fault are all exaggerated, if not entirely without foundation. So that just shows you how the Baha'i point of view or lens helps us understand what the prophet means. Even though we aren't Islamic scholars, we recognize right away, well, we know the judgment, the day of judgment, or the day of days is the advent of the Bab. He says so himself. And we know that the Bab is the symbolic return of the 12th Imam. So we'll get all into that when we get into the Baha'i faith. So we're going to have a lot of fun, or at least I am. I hope you do too. So the life of Muhammad, let's get back to that. I've given you this several times, but I like to repeat these, not only for our benefit tonight, but mostly because since you download these slides, some of you do, I want you to have it available so you don't have to pull up a previous set of slides from a previous class. So here is you see just in two pages, the major events in the life of Muhammad. And so last week we got through his birth, the events that occurred at his birth, his trip to after he marries Khadijah, as a result of, she notices him because he's such a faithful caravan driver and trusted of all. He bears the title Amin, which means trusted one. So you can see here, if I press the right button here, he begins to gather followers in Mecca after his experience in the cave on Mount Hira, which is called Jabal an-Nur, which means the mountain of light. And of course, Nur is like Nur, where Baha'u'llah comes from, the province of Nur and Mazandaran, the area of Nur. And so we're going, the reason I like this little simple one is that it gives the main highlights we will get into. Though we're not going to get into great details about the three major battles, other than the Battle of the Trench, we'll do a little with. If you want more, just let me know and we can, but I'll go over the strategies involved, the reasons for them. So we saw this slide last time, the birth of Muhammad, and the various events that signaled the advent of a new manifestation. The story of Muhammad as a youth. Now, I tried to remember this, but I had it in the notes under the slide, and then I realized that I didn't have access to the notes because I didn't know how to do that. Now I do. But then I realized if I put it in the notes, then it won't be available on your slides. So instead, I wrote it out on a slide for you because it's a beautiful story. The name, and I couldn't remember it last time, is at a certain age, the young Muhammad was sent to Syria between the ages of 9 and 12. And again, you have various accounts of what his exact age was. The young Muhammad met Bahira, or Bahira. One other thing I will, just as a side note, I talked to my friends with whom I translate on Fridays, my dear friends, the Himat brothers, and we translate poetry that of Tahirih primarily. And I ask about the pronunciation of these terribly difficult words, some of them. And they said, don't worry, they're pronounced one way in Arabic, they're pronounced another way in Persian, and in English, you pronounce them however you want. So you need not worry that you or I are pronouncing them correctly, at least for the purposes of this course. So either in Bahre or Bahira or Bahara, in the town of Basra in Syria. Basra, of course, is still a town today. While traveling with a Meccan caravan, accompanying his uncle Abu Talib. When the caravan passed by his cell, and a cell in this case, a monk lived in an isolation, and a cell doesn't mean a prison cell, but the monks where he habitates. The monk invited the merchants to a feast. They accepted the invitation, leaving the boy to guard the camels. Bahire, however, insisted that everyone in the caravan should come to him. Then a miraculous occurrence indicated to the monk that Muhammad would become a prophet. When he sat under a tree, Muhammad, sorry, I should have capitalized the age there, its branches moved to shade him. The movement of a cloud kept shadowing Muhammad, regardless of the time of day, and that drew Bahira's attention. The monk revealed his visions of Muhammad's future to the boy's uncle, Abu Talib, warning him to preserve the child from harm. Bahira then found the announcement of the coming of Muhammad in the Gospels, and that would have to be either in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, probably John. We don't know. But the point is, he found the passage that in other words, he is one of the few we know of who was a Christian that used his own prophecies to discover Muhammad. Now, what we're going to define, and what you may already know, is when we get to the study of the Baha'i writings, that the Book of Certitude has as its explicit purpose during the first half of it the explication of 3 verses about the coming of Muhammad. And this very interesting story of why why Baha'u'llah chooses those verses, how he interprets them, and why he interprets them. Why, in other words, if his primary audience consists of Muslims, is he telling Muslims how they should have interpreted the New Testament in order to convert the Christians to Islam? And we'll discover the answer to that. Well, we dealt with this last time too, but we'll just remember that when Muhammad lost his father, a shepherd's wife cared for him in the mountains until he was 5, as was the custom. He tended sheep, he lost his mother, and he would sit by the old chieftain on a rug spread in the shade of the Kaaba. Now, it's pronounced Kaaba or Kaaba at 8. And so, in other words, he was already attracted to this sacred place, even though it was used for the worship of idols by this time. Muhammad was poor and practiced several trades. He tended herds, kept a little shop, went on caravan expeditions to the great fairs, and became known for the purity of his life, so that he became Al-Amin. And that's, you'd think it would be El-Amin, but they changed it to, it's just stands for the trusted one, but they changed it to Al as short for Allah. The moral degeneration of his fellow people and his own quest for a true religion further lent fuel to this, with the result that he now began to withdraw periodically to the cave on Mount Hira, 3 miles north of Mecca, for contemplation and reflection. And here again, the picture of Mount Hira, the Mount of Light. When he was nearly 40, he used to spend many hours alone in prayer and speculating over the aspects of creation. He was concerned with Jahiliyah, which is the ignorance of the divine guidance that was displayed by the way that the Kaaba was used, the social unrest, the injustice, the widespread discrimination, particularly against women, the fighting among the tribes. And this has something right here. I'll just clue you in. That this has something to do with the question about the spreading of Islam with the sword. How do we justify that? And the abuse of tribal authorities prevalent in pre-Islamic Arabia. And this, I showed you last time, I believe, the entrance to the cave. This is the view of Mecca as it is now from the cave. That tallest edifice you see right here is right next to the Kaaba. He married Khadijah, who was 16 years his elder, as I mentioned last time. She proposed to him, at least according to one. There are several versions of almost all of these stories. She was a merchant, and Muhammad, as her agent, successfully conducted one of her caravans. She had rejected marriage to the leaders of Mecca, but fell in love with this poor kinsman, 16 years her junior. They had a number of children. All the sons died. Then she became the mother of Fatima, the holiest woman in Islam. And of course, we're familiar with Fatima because the first major revealed work of Baha'u'llah, or at least one of them, is the Hidden Words, which is the hidden book of Fatima, which is supposedly not supposedly, but said to be the work that was shown to her at her death by Muhammad to comfort her when, not her death, the death of her father, the holiest woman in Islam. So the first intimation of his mission, we mentioned last time, he was in the cave. Again, several versions of this story, but in the cave, he has a vision of the archangel Jabril, as he's called in the Quran. And the story of the archangel is chronologically, the first surah in the Quran. Now it's number 96, 96, as you can see here, in the standard chronology, the standard order of the Quran. And so you see here how valuable it is if you have a chronologically ordered Quran, which we'll get to in very shortly, because that's the way it was intended to be. And Ali, the second to recognize Muhammad after Khadijah, he put his version of the Quran in chronological order, but no one would accept it for reasons, again, we'll get to. So according to the Sunni tradition, and according to the Shia as well, because it's in the Quran, and we'll get on to that right here. This is as I say, the first chronologically. The angel Gabriel says to Muhammad, read or proclaim. It can be, the word can be translated either way, probably proclaim, because that's his job, is to reveal. In the name of thy Lord and cherisher, who created man out of a mere clot of congealed blood, proclaim, and thy Lord is most bountiful. He who taught the use of the pen, taught man that which he knew not. And so the Guardian is, I believe we saw this slide last time, the Guardian says, he vindicates that this really happened. It's kind of strange, it bothered me when I first read it, that Well, if he's a manifestation and knows he's a manifestation, why would he be so concerned that he runs home and has his wife wrap him in a mantle because he's so shaken by it? And then I realized that when I read this from God Passes By, when he's talking, this is the midst of the guardian's discussion of how profound the experience was when Baha'u'llah in the Sea of Chal had his first intimation of his mission and had the vision of the veiled maiden in a dream. In another passage, this is the guardian speaking, he describes briefly and graphically the impact of the onrushing force of the divine summons upon his entire being, talking about Baha'u'llah, an experience vividly recalling the vision of God that caused Moses to fall in a swoon, the voice of Gabriel which plunged Muhammad into such consternation that, hurrying to the shelter of his home, he bade his wife Khadijah envelop him in his mantle. So that would seem to vindicate that this actually happened. And this is the second surah chronologically, but notice it's surah 74 in the standard edition of the Quran. And it's about being wrapped in the mantle. And it's the voice of Gabriel speaking to Muhammad, "O thou wrapped in a mantle, arise and deliver thy warning." Again, he's a warner. What is the warning? Well, the warning is the coming of the judgment. "And thy Lord do thou magnify, and thy garments keep free from stain, and all abomination shun, nor expect in giving any increase, and expect in giving any increase for thyself." In other words, don't expect that you're going to benefit from what you're going to give. "But thy Lord's cause be patient, for thy Lord's cause be patient and constant." And constancy is a very important word right here, because you're going to find one of the 5 proofs at the end of the book of certitude is the constancy of the prophet in his suffering, the constancy in proclaiming the word of God during his manifestation. And another thing you will find interesting is that the same quality of constancy is applicable, of course, to every manifestation. And there's even a passage that Lucia was reading to me today that she found where in a prayer, Baha'u'llah, in fact, what she read tonight is part of that prayer, is praising God for the trials that he has been given. So that will be that day, a day of distress. What day? And of course, the capital day is the day of days when the trumpet is sounded. And of course, those of you who've studied the faith for a while know there's 2 trumpets that are mentioned in the Quran. The first one is the appearance of the Bab, or sometimes alluded to as the appearance of Tahireh unveiled at the conference of Badasht, which we will also get to in our studies. And so that day, a day of distress for those who are without faith. In other words, if you don't know what it's about, you'll be confounded, in the same way that in this day, in a talk I've given on the pandemic, I talk about this, that if you don't have a Baha'i lens and know where we are in history and that it's going to turn out for the best, then this doesn't mean you don't suffer from what we will go through or are going through, but it does mean you know that it is ultimately glorious in its in the long run. The ultimately glorious is a direct quote from the first paragraph of "The promised day has come." So be patient, and the trumpet, and then also the day of distress. These allude directly to things that only from a Baha'i perspective can you really understand what is being alluded to. In the years after, or the after years, Muhammad said of his wife Khadijah, "When I was poor, she enriched me. When all the world abandoned me, she comforted me. When they treated me as a liar, she believed in me." An account relates that in the early stage of the revelation, when Muhammad was still in anguish at the phenomenon, he asked Khadijah to wrap him in his robe as a kind of protection. This is repeating that same thing. So notes about the Quran before we continue with the history. So we're kind of switching back and forth, but I think you will get a sense of the continuity of what we're doing, that we're progressing little by little in history, the history of Muhammad, the background. But I thought before we go any further, you need a little background information about the Quran. The Quran, as it is currently structured, I've referred to that several times, came into being about 650. Now, this is 20 years after the death of Muhammad, when the third caliph, Uthman bin Affan, began noticing slight differences in pronunciation of the Quran, and pronunciation really isn't the best word there. The best word would be in the way it was, the sequence of surah. As Islam expanded beyond the Arabian Peninsula into Persia, the Levant, which is the eastern part of the Mediterranean, and North Africa. In order to preserve the sanctity of the text, he ordered a committee headed by Zayd to use Abu Bakr's copy and prepare a standard copy of the Quran. And this became, all the others that didn't comply with this were destroyed. Well, as you're going to find out later in our class, either tonight or next class, you're going to find out why Ali had it right and what he did to try to get other people to, he shared it around Mecca, and no one, did I say Ali? Muhammad shared his, no, excuse me, it was Ali, after the death of Muhammad, shared his true copy of the Quran in the right order, but no one would listen to him. Thus, within 20 years of Muhammad's death, the Quran was committed to a written form. And it was written, in other words, before it had been written, but in all kinds of different places. I'm going to show you in a second the shoulder blade of a camel where one of the surah is written. That text became the model from which copies were made and promulgated throughout the urban centers of the Muslim world, and other versions are believed to have been destroyed. The present form of the Quran text is accepted by Muslim scholars to be the original version compiled by Abu Bakr. But as we're going to find out, Abu Bakr was one of those who participated in the breaching of the covenant of Baha'u'llah. According to Shia, now Shia is a Shiite sect of Islam, sometimes called the Twelvers, because they believe in the succession of the 12 imams, the first of whom was Ali. So according to Shiite belief or tradition, and sometimes these are based on authentic or authoritative traditions, and we'll get to that later too, but a tradition or a hadith, some of them were recorded by both Shia and Sunni, but they may not agree that they are authoritative. Now, why? Well, what we're going to find out is that from Baha'u'llah, we know that everything the prophet says, whether he's in a state of revelation or not, is authoritative and infallible. But they accepted as infallible only the things that occurred when Muhammad was in a revelatory state, in which case he would be shaking as if he had epilepsy or so on. And the theory was for some that he must have been epileptic. Well, no, this was how he demonstrated to them, this is from God through Gabriel, from me to you. So this is authoritative. The order of this text differed from that gathered during Uthman's era in that the version had been collected in chronological order. Despite this, he made no objection against the standardized Quran and accepted the Quran in circulation. That is, Ali didn't. And so you have the question, why didn't Ali do something? He knows the truth. Why doesn't he stop this? Well, we'll find out why. This, my friends, is something you can't see because it's too small, but I'll tell you what it is because you will be able to see on your slides. as it says, this is the arrangement of the Quran in chronological order, according to Rodwell's original 1909 edition of the Quran. The first one I bought in 1959 was what was available at the bookstore at Vanderbilt, and it was the Quran in chronological order. And what he does, which is interesting, as you can see, the first column is the first surah according chronology. So this is all chronological order. The second is the surah in the number of the accepted version of the Quran. You'll see this absolutely no logic to it. All right. It's just basically shortest. I forget now. I've already said, and I forget it. Longest to shortest, the shortest to longest. The shortest being about 3 verses, and the longest being over 200 verses. So this is very valuable if you want to study it according to the events in the life of Muhammad. Certainly, they inform it's internal evidence informing the meaning of the surah. So what are the things that Muhammad talked about in the Quran? Well, his major themes are fairly obvious, and that is the unity of God. And of course, that you say, well, that goes all the way back to Abraham. And it does, the oneness, the monotheistic belief. But oneness is a little different because it means that not only there's one God, but all these other images of God are but expressions of a single God. You cannot divide God. And this also sets up this discussion of the Trinitarian view. So that's one thing. And there, I've put down a verse in the Quran, or excuse me, a surah in the Quran that deals with this. The denunciation of polytheism, which would be concomitant with that. Belief in the last judgment and its recompense. And of course, that's referring to the advent of the Bab and Baha'u'llah. Social and economic justice. This is one of the major things that Muhammad and Islam contributed. Even though it got bastardized after Muhammad's death, the concept was there. And he even created a model of it with the Constitution of Medina. That he had been sent as a messenger of God. And he lists all of the messengers of God the same way that Baha'u'llah does in the very opening passages of the Book of Certitude. In fact, the opening of the Book of Certitude is taken largely, as he says, from the Surah of Hud in the Quran. That God is one who is all-powerful, the creator and controller of the universe. That God is merciful towards his creations. Notice creations, plural. That that worship should be made only to God, and that ascribing partnership to God is a major sin. Notice this is the third statement of this essentially same thing, that God, there's one God, only one God, that God is the creator, that God is self-sufficient, and that you do not add gods to God, which in effect was what the literal Trinitarian doctrine did. That men would be accountable for their deeds to God on the last judgment day and would be assigned to heaven or hell. And again, we know that those are metaphors, as Baha'u'llah explains, but the Muslims accept them as quite literal. That God expects man to be generous with their wealth and not miserly. And so one of the pillars of Islam is giving to the poor. One of the 5 pillars of Islam. So this is the thing about the epilepsy and about the revelatory condition. And there are some accounts, one by, I think, Taruzallah Samandari, of seeing Baha'u'llah, but there's a couple of written accounts in the works of Tahirzadeh of seeing Baha'u'llah reveal and the kind of power that emanated from him and that was coming to him, and what an exhausting experience it was for him. The claims that the Prophet Muhammad suffered from epilepsy rest on a number of shaky, oh God, that's a terrible pun, isn't it? No, I didn't write that. Assumptions not supported by medical research. They are based solely on the many different descriptions of his state during his reception of revelation. First, the prophet received revelation when he was 40 years old. This would mean that the prophet suddenly developed epilepsy later in life, as it has never been reported that he suffered from such experiences before. This is highly unlikely from a medical perspective, so that discounts that he was an epileptic. Moreover, epilepsy is seen as one way of explaining the prophet's visions and spiritual experiences, because materialist historians and materialist religious students of religion, which are all these days mostly social students of sociology, because you can't have in a scholarly field unless it's paranormal psychology at Duke or something, you can't accept the idea that metaphysical reality can play a part in history or in anything else you're studying. So this would be a neat means for those who don't like the idea of a spiritual reality as being probable or possible to discount this as anything other than a disease. The problem for the future would be that all he said when not in a revelatory state, the hadiths, though set down as faithfully as were the surah, would not be regarded as having an infallible authority. This is the crucial observation that I'm making here, and it's mine. It's not really just mine, but it's something that I find extremely important. In light, again, through the Baha'i lens of something Baha'u'llah says about the fact that everything the prophet does and says is for our benefit and has purpose. Now, this is a statement by a scholar, Henry Corbin. Not a single verse of the Quran descended upon or was revealed to the messenger of God, which he did not proceed to dictate to me. Now, this is a quote from Ali, and he would instruct me as to its literal explanation and the spiritual exegesis, the verse which it abrogates and the abrogated verse, the fixed and the ambiguous, the particular and the general meanings. In other words, Ali not only did he memorize the verses of the Quran immediately after they were revealed, but he would talk with Muhammad, who would explain to him all the various levels of meaning that the verse had. So you can see Ali, as the appointed successor, what he could have done by way of clarifying all the abstruse or ambiguous or troublesome passages in the Quran, as could the succeeding 11 imams, all of whom the Baha'i writings tell us were appointed of God and infallible. The structure of the Quran, as commonly accepted, or as uncommonly, in other words, these definitions apply to Rodwell's chronological Quran as well. A surah is a single revelation or a chapter. I've said this before, but it's sort of like the hidden words in that it stands alone. So sometimes you'll find a continuity, but it's by chance if you do. Whereas chronologically, you will find some relevance to the sequence. There are 114 surah of varying length, each divided into ayahs or verses. The Quran is generally arranged from the longest to the shortest. The reason I always get it wrong is because that sounds counterintuitive, doesn't it? The shortest chapter, Al-Qasar, and that's the Qasar is the stream in paradise, has only, and it's the term you'll find a lot in the Baha'i writings, not as Al-Qasar, but Al-Qasar, has only 3 verses, while the longest, Al-Baqarah, contains 286 verses. There are 86 classified as Meccan, while 28 are Medinan. So in other words, the bulk of them were revealed while he was still in Mecca, while 28 are revealed when he is in Medina. Now, This means most of them are revealed before the Hijrah, before he immigrates from Mecca to Medina, because he dies fairly shortly after returning to Mecca. There are within some of them numbered sections or paragraphs, though these numbers are not used in a citation from the work. So in the same way you would say John 3:16 is the 3rd chapter, the 16th verse of the book of John, for God so loved the world and so forth. The same way with the Quran. All you need is the number of the surah and the verse number. But each surah further has a name, and each begins with the invocation, in the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful, though that's not counted as a verse. Here is a photograph of the blade of a shoulder blade of a camel, and you can see the Arabic written on the back of it is one of the surah. And most people could not read or write, so the Quran was delivered orally, but soon the surah were written down on whatever was available when the prophet would enter a revelatory state. This is a photo of a camel's shoulder blade, and as I said. The Guardian's translations. Now, the Guardian, of course, had to translate a lot of the Quran because so many of the passages in not only the Book of Certitude, but elsewhere, Baha'u'llah, remember his primary audience that he is speaking to are Muslim. And so he is not only vindicating Muhammad and the Quran, but he is unlocking the keys to the meanings of the Quran. So the Guardian, when he translates the Book of Certitude, which is in Persian, into English, he translates the quotes from the Quran. And you will find that they're very close to Rodwell's translation, which, as I said, he praises the eloquence of Rodwell's translation. Though you will also find on longer passages that he will change a word here and there and so on. So he doesn't accept anything out of hand. He does his own. Ocean, which most of you may be familiar with. If not, we can explain it later, is an online educational tool that Chad Jones has put together over the years in many different forms, but you can look up passages from various versions of the Quran through that. And it has both Rodwell and the one that is used most by scholars by Yosef Ali. Yosef Ali's version is valuable because it's so literal. And as I say, he puts in parentheses anything that is that's not there, that he's adding or interpreting. Then finally, there are what are called disconnected letters. This is something we won't get to. We may not get to them at all. If I put a URL for you to look up the what's more about them on Bahaipedia. It used to be Bahaipedia, but now it's called Bahaipedia, which is a Baha'i site dedicated to information about Baha'is. So if you want to find out a lot about me, you can look me up on Bahaipedia. It only says a few lines, though, and doesn't have any really personal information. The disconnected letters, very strange thing. Nobody in Islam has given any satisfactory explanation. Baha'u'llah and the Bab do. These are seemingly random letters of the Arabic alphabet, but were always included in these particular chapters, 14 of them. Over the centuries, there have been many attempts to unravel their meaning. The fifth Imam indicated one level of meaning to them. Baha'i, and of course, no doubt that was infallibly given, but it was only one level. Baha'u'llah, however, wrote a long tablet about them in answer to a query from a believer. In the Qayyum al-Asma, which is, of course, the study of the Surah of Joseph, though the word Qayyum al-Asma, as I've said before, means the best of stories. And it is the best of stories, isn't it? Foreshadowing the advent of Baha'u'llah. The Bab likewise uses the disconnected letters at the start of the chapters. And so you can see, as I say, this website to study them. I don't really want to spend our time on them, at least not now, maybe later. So now we switch back to the life of Muhammad, but only for a few minutes because we're coming to the end of our allotted time. Allotted by whom, I'm not sure, but perhaps by my age. So Ali, the second to believe in Baha'u'llah, I love this story. After the surah of the brightness, which brought him consolation and told him, thy Lord hath not forsaken thee, he, Muhammad, felt confident of his prophetic mission. The faithful spirit taught him to pray, perform ablutions, stand and kneel in worship. One day, and of course, a lot of those are similar to what we do with the long obligatory prayer. One day, as he and Khadijah were praying together, young Ali entered the room. He saw them bowing down before empty space. He said, what are you doing? Before whom are you bowing down? Muhammad said, before God, whose prophet I am. Ali accepted the faith immediately, and in the future he was called him whose face was never sullied, because he was so young, excuse me, when he became a believer that he had never worshiped an idol, as was the custom in his culture. So we get to the point at 43, 3 years later, or excuse me, not the 3 years after that, but after 3 years, Muhammad was commanded to preach in public. Now, commanded by whom? Commanded by God through the angel Gabriel. So you see this in Quranic verses, and you see them in Baha'i verses. Say, colon, and then you have something following. What we infer, at least what I infer, is that he's not telling us to repeat that. This is the voice of God telling him to tell us what follows. My understanding. Profess publicly what thou hast been bidden and withdraw from those who join gods to God, the idol worshippers. He invited his kinsmen, the leaders of Mecca, had a sheep cooked with milk, and after they had eaten, he freely told them what had happened, ending, never before has an Arab bestowed on his people what I now bring you. Who will act as my brother and helper? There was icy silence. Abu Lahab, one of his uncles, shrugged his shoulders. Then young Ali cried out, I will help you, prophet of God. And they all laughed, and the meeting broke up. And so what we get to is, as Muhammad begins in the later years to teach openly at the age of 43, the Meccans not only turn against him, but his own family and own clan, both the Quraysh and the Hashim, turned against him. And this, again, is a common theme, at least from our point of view as Baha'is, that it seems hardest for those to accept the manifestation who are the closest to the manifestation. And I never understood that until I went on pilgrimage. And I was in the room of Baha'u'llah at Baji, and I entered his room with great trepidation, and I've written about this in a couple of my books. And everyone fell on the floor in prayer. I mean, not fell, but they kneeled down and prayed because his bed is arranged right in the center of it. And when I looked at it, I was just stunned because it was so short. And I found out that Baha'u'llah was a diminutive man. And that shocked me. And I went out into the hallway, and I was so shaken by that. You never know what's going to test your faith. And so what it is, as I understood once the pilgrimage was over and I tried to figure out why that shook me so, I realized that the closer you are to the human aspect of the manifestation, the harder it would be to accept that he is of a higher order and sent by God and has this lofty station. That's, I suspect, number one, why it is the closest ones of the family who reject them. And secondly, it is why you see such miraculous accomplishments and certitude on the part of those like Abdul Baha and his daughter, Bahia Khanum, to accept him. So this happened with the guardian as well, as most of you know. His own family were the worst covenant breakers that the guardian had to face. So we'll stop here with his statement that's very important. I am only a man like you, because it's a very famous passage like this in another passage of the Quran, where Muhammad says, I am only a man like you, and I am an apostle of God.